The rain had been falling for hours, a soft rhythmic patter against the windows of the small apartment in Chicago's South Side. It was the kind of night when everything seemed too heavy, too dark, too suffocating. Hannah Montgomery sat at her kitchen table, staring at the half-written pages of her novel, her pen poised but unmoving in her hand. The words she'd been struggling to write for weeks wouldn't come. Not tonight. Not with the weight of everything pressing down on her. David was in the other room watching TV, a can of cheap beer in his hand. She could hear the soft hiss as he cracked it open, the sound strangely loud in the silence that filled the apartment. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:47 p.m. He should have been home hours ago. But when David drank, time didn't matter. She ran a hand through her dark brown hair, the strands limp and tangled. She had always been a woman of ideas, of dreams. But now all she could do was survive the next hour. And the next. And the next. When she and David had first met, everything had felt so full of possibility. They were both in their late 20s, newly graduated from college, with bright eyes and big plans. They'd fallen in love easily, too easily perhaps. They'd married in a small ceremony at a courthouse, just the two of them, a promise they'd made without knowing what it would cost them. For a while it was perfect. They'd both had good jobs. They'd both been happy. But after Lily came along, everything had changed. Lily was born in the dead of winter, on a night so cold that the air outside seemed to freeze before it hit the ground. David had been ecstatic at first, a little too ecstatic, maybe. He would cradle Lily in his arms, cooing to her in a way that made Hannah believe things might stay that way forever. But somewhere in those first few months a crack had formed. It started with little things. David came home late from work, more often than he had before. He spent hours in the garage tinkering with his car, and when he wasn't tinkering he was drinking. First just a beer here and there. Then whole bottles of whiskey disappearing on a nightly basis. It was like the more he drank, the less he saw her, or maybe the less he saw himself. Hannah didn't know when the shift happened, when he'd become this version of himself, the angry, bitter man who couldn't even look at his own daughter without turning away. She had tried to help him at first. She'd suggested counseling, but he had laughed at the idea. "What, you think a shrink is going to fix me?" he'd scoffed. "I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." But the truth was, David did need help. The problem was he didn't want it. And so, over time, Hannah had learned to stay quiet, to take whatever he dished out, whether it was his slurred insults or his sudden rages. She didn't fight back anymore. She couldn't. She looked at the papers in front of her again. Her novel. It had started as a form of escape. She'd always wanted to write, even when she was a little girl. Words had been her refuge, her safe place when the world seemed too loud, too confusing. And yet, here she was, unable to put another sentence down. Her dreams, the ones she used to cling to so tightly, felt like distant echoes from the other room. David's voice broke through her thoughts. "Hannah," he shouted, "where the hell is my dinner?" His words were thick with alcohol, slurred and stumbling. She could hear the anger building, even in the way he said her name. He didn't have to say anything more. She knew what was coming. Another fight. Another night spent trying to keep him calm, trying to keep Lily from waking up. She got up from the table, rubbing her eyes. The house felt small. Too small for the tension that had grown between them. She walked into the kitchen where David was sitting at the table, his face flushed red with rage, his shirt untucked and stained. The sight of him, this man she had once loved, made her stomach turn. "I'm not making dinner tonight," she said, keeping her voice level, careful. "You're on your own." David's eyes flashed, the dark circles beneath them deepening as he stood up. The chair scraped loudly across the floor, making her flinch. "What the hell did you just say to me?" He took a step toward her, his body wobbling slightly, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. "I'm done," Hannah said, the words coming out more forcefully than she had intended. She had been preparing herself for this moment for weeks, but saying it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. "I can't keep doing this, David." His face twisted in disbelief. What, you're just going to leave me? After everything I've done for you? After everything I've put up with from you? She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. No. I'm leaving because I can't do this anymore. You don't love me, David. Not the way I need. You don't love her either, she added, her voice cracking as she thought of their daughter, Lily, who was just a few rooms away, asleep in her bed. I'm not raising my daughter in this environment. I'm not going to let her grow up thinking this is how love works. David's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she saw something dark flicker in his expression. Something primal, like a predator being backed into a corner. You think you're better than me? He spat. You think you can just walk out on me and everything will be fine? You're nothing without me. She stood her ground, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. I'm everything without you. And so is Lily. For a moment there was silence. Then David did something she hadn't expected. He broke down. The anger melted away, replaced by something that was almost worse, desperation. He sank into the chair, his hands trembling, his face buried in his palms. Please, Hannah. Don't do this. I can change. I swear I'll change. Just don't leave me. Hannah could feel the years of hurt pushing against her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had loved him once. She had believed in him, in them. But the man who sat before her now, broken, lost, drunk, wasn't the man she had married. He hadn't been for a long time. I'm sorry, David. But it's over, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned and walked toward the door. And for the first time in years, Hannah felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just a little. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, where she would go or how she would survive. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never go back. Not this time, not ever again. The bus ride to Toledo felt like a slow exhale, each mile pulling Hannah further from the life she had once known, and closer to the unknown. She sat near the window, clutching Lily's small hand in her own, watching the cityscape of Chicago blur into the night as the bus hummed steadily along the highway. The streets she had walked for the last 5 years, the ones that had once felt so familiar, so permanent, were now just memories, fading like the tail lights of the car they had driven to the station in. Lily had fallen asleep on her lap, her small face pressed against Hannah's jacket, her blonde curls tangled around her fingers. Hannah stroked her daughter's hair softly, wondering how she would explain all of this to her someday. How do you explain to a child that her father had changed, that the man who once doted on her had now become a stranger, a danger? How do you make her understand that the life she had known, the safety she had taken for granted, was no longer something to trust? Hannah closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat, the constant hum of the bus lulling her into a strange, exhausted calm. There was no going back now. She had made the choice, and though it had cost her everything, a marriage, a life, a home, she knew it was the right one. But the future was a terrifying thing. She didn't know what awaited her in Toledo. She only knew that she couldn't stay in Chicago. Not with David still out there, roaming through the wreckage of their life, drinking himself into oblivion and threatening anything that got in his way. She had cut off all contact, but that didn't mean he wouldn't find her. He was relentless when he was sober, and completely unpredictable when he wasn't. Her phone had been silent for days, the last message from David a string of drunken texts, full of threats, apologies, and more threats. The idea of seeing him again made her stomach churn, and no, she couldn't risk it. She looked down at Lily again, a pang of guilt twisting her chest. Her daughter deserved more than this. More than being raised in fear. In a home where the man who was supposed to love her was slowly losing himself to alcohol. She deserved peace. She deserved a chance at a real life. And so, Hannah had made the only choice she could. Leave before it was too late. By the time they arrived in Toledo, it was well after midnight. The city was quiet, the streets slick with rain that had followed them south from Chicago. Hannah's legs felt like lead as she stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement of the station parking lot. The night air was damp and cold, cutting through her thin jacket like a blade. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone waiting for her, someone who would stop her from going any further, someone who would remind her that she was being foolish, but the parking lot was empty. For a moment, Hannah simply stood there, the weight of what she had just done sinking in. She had left everything behind. Her home, her friends, her career, all of it. And now she was standing in a city she had never seen before, with just the contents of a suitcase and a dream that felt increasingly fragile in the cold, indifferent night. She shook her head, pushing the doubt aside. There was no time for that. She couldn't afford to let herself fall apart now. Lily stirred in her arms, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mama!" Hannah smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from Lily's forehead. "I'm here, baby. We're here." She could see the dim light of her sister Natalie's apartment building in the distance. Natalie had insisted they come, offered up her couch with no questions asked, but even as grateful as she was, the thought of imposing on her sister's small space made her feel uncomfortable. She hadn't seen Natalie in over a year. Not since the holidays when the tension between her and David had been at its worst. But Natalie had always been there for her, even when their parents hadn't been. "We're going to be okay, Lily," she murmured to her daughter, as if the words could convince her as much as they did herself. "We're going to be better than okay." The walk to Natalie's apartment was short but felt like a lifetime. The streets of Toledo were eerily quiet, the occasional car driving by the only sound breaking the silence. When they arrived at the building, Hannah's feet ached, and the weight of their bags seemed to double with each step. She punched in the entry code and made her way up the narrow staircase. Natalie's apartment was on the second floor. A cramped but cozy space, filled with mismatched furniture and half-packed boxes. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was all she had. When she knocked on the door, it opened almost immediately. "Hannah!" Natalie's voice was a mixture of surprise and relief. "You made it." Hannah stepped into the warm, cluttered apartment, the familiar smell of coffee and candles wrapping around her like a hug. Natalie was already holding out her arms, pulling her into an embrace that was both comforting and heartbreaking. "I'm so glad you're here," Natalie said, her voice muffled as she hugged her tighter. "God, I can't believe you're really here." "I didn't know where else to go," Hannah replied quietly, feeling the weight of her decision settle heavily on her shoulders. Natalie pulled back slightly, glancing down at Lily, who was still half asleep in her arms. "I know. It's okay. We'll figure it out. You're safe now." Hannah nodded, but she wasn't so sure. The future still felt like a giant question mark. She had left Chicago with nothing but the hope that things would get better. That things could get better. But now that they were here, she wasn't sure what she could build out of the wreckage. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Toledo was a far cry from the busy streets of Chicago, a quieter, smaller city that felt like a million miles away. Hannah found a job as a substitute teacher, something she could do while she figured out what came next. It wasn't ideal, but it paid the bills and gave her a routine. Money was tight, but they managed. Natalie helped when she could, though she had her own struggles to deal with. She worked long hours at a coffee shop downtown, her tips barely covering rent. But they made do. There was a strange kind of peace in the simplicity of their days. A peace Hannah hadn't known for years, but it wasn't enough. Every day, Hannah would sit in the small corner of Natalie's apartment with her laptop, writing whenever she could. Her novel, the one she'd started back in Chicago, became her lifeline, her only escape from the grinding weight of survival. There were times when she thought about giving up on it altogether, when the exhaustion of it all seemed too much. But there was always that small flicker of hope that kept her going. The idea that maybe, just maybe, this could be the way out. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the city outside, wondering if David would ever find her. Would he come looking? Would he even remember what he had done to her, to them? Or had he already moved on to the next target? She didn't know. And in some ways she wasn't sure it mattered anymore. All she knew was this: she had to keep moving forward, and so she did. It was a year before Hannah truly believed that the life she was building could last. The first few months in Toledo had been a blur of adjustment, Too many unknowns, too many late nights worrying about money, about Lily, about how long she could keep up this charade of normalcy. But now, a year later, there was a sense of rhythm to her days. Even if that rhythm was nothing more than survival, she had settled into a routine. Substitute teaching during the day, writing whenever she could, usually at the small cafe a few blocks away from Natalie's apartment. The cafe was her refuge, a place where the noise of the world, and of her mind, quieted long enough for her to lose herself in the world of her characters. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But it was hers. And it was something she could control. Lily now had adapted to the change better than Hannah had dared hope. The first few months had been rough. The little girl had missed her father desperately, asking why he wasn't there and whether he was coming back. And each time, Hannah had to find new ways to explain the unexplainable, to reassure her that no, he wasn't coming back, that things would be different now, that they were safe. But there were moments, quiet moments, when Lily would climb into her lap with her favorite book, or when she would tell Hannah about her day at preschool. That made the sacrifice worth it. The weight of it all, the loneliness, the uncertainty, became just a little more bearable. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was life. And it was a far cry from what she had left behind. Hannah had always been a dreamer, but now her dreams were something more tangible. She wasn't just writing anymore. She was writing to survive. She had finished her novel months ago, after countless hours spent in the cafe, pouring her heart onto the pages. It had started as therapy, a way to make sense of the life she'd lived with David, a way to deal with the anger, the confusion. But now it had become something more. It had become the key to a future she never thought she would have. The Sound of Silence was a book about a woman trapped in a toxic relationship, finding the strength to break free. It was a story of survival, of reclaiming one's life, and it was Hannah's story in more ways than one. She had poured everything into it. The pain, the isolation, the longing for something better. It wasn't an easy story to write, but it was cathartic. And when the last sentence had been typed, she had felt a weight lift off her chest. But then came the hard part, submitting the manuscript. Her first few attempts at finding a publisher were met with rejection. The standard thanks but no thanks responses that every writer had faced at some point in their careers. The letters would pile up in the corner of her apartment, the dust of disappointment gathering like a fog. It would have been easy to give up, to say that this was just another dream that wasn't meant to be. But she didn't. She kept sending the manuscript out, making small tweaks here and there, refining her pitch. She wrote agents and editors, asked for advice, never once allowing herself to believe that failure was an option. She had come too far for that. Finally, one afternoon in early spring, she got a call. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like the most important 5 minutes of her life. "I read your manuscript," the voice on the other end of the phone said. "And I think we have something here." Hannah's heart stopped for a second, then hammered in her chest. She could feel her palms sweat as she gripped the phone tighter, as if she might lose the connection if she let go. "I'm with Hannon and Finch Literary Agency," the voice continued, "and we'd like to represent you, if you're interested." "Wait, you're saying you want to represent me? Like, you want to publish my book?" "Exactly. We believe in the story, and we'd like to take it to some publishers we work with." Hannah could hardly catch her breath. Her head swam. Her mouth went dry. "You're sure?" The voice on the other end chuckled, the sound warm and reassuring. "We're sure." She had to sit down. The weight of it all, the years of struggle, of fear, of not knowing if she would ever get out from under David's shadow, was suddenly replaced with something else. Something she couldn't quite name yet, but it was there, swelling inside her chest. It was hope. Real, honest hope. "I'll send over the contract details later today," the agent said, cutting through the haze of her thoughts. "And congratulations, Ms. Montgomery. You're about to be a published author." The next few months were a whirlwind. The contract was signed. A publisher, a small but well-established one, agreed to take on her book. It was edited and reworked, polished until it shone, until it became something entirely different from the raw manuscript she had first written. And when The Sound of Silence hit shelves, Hannah couldn't have imagined the reaction it would receive. The book was an instant hit, not a best-selling juggernaut, but enough to make waves in the literary world. Reviews were glowing. Readers connected with it in ways Hannah hadn't anticipated. But it wasn't just the book's success that gave her the most satisfaction. It was the fact that, for the first time in years, she had done something for herself. Something real. Something that had nothing to do with David or with survival. It was a new life. That winter, Hannah was invited to speak at a book event in New York. She and Lily flew out for the occasion, and though the trip was whirlwind and hectic, there was a moment, a quiet moment, when Hannah sat on the balcony of their hotel room, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city below, that she finally allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. She had made it out. And she had built something from the ashes of her past. As she watched Lily, now big enough to run around the hotel room like a little whirlwind, a quiet joy settled in Hannah's heart. She had feared that the price of freedom was too high, that she would never escape the weight of her past. But now, as the city sparkled below her, she realized that the price hadn't been freedom itself. It had been everything she had once thought was permanent. But as she looked at Lily, her daughter, her whole world, she knew without a doubt that it had been worth it. All of it. The years of struggle, of running, of hiding. Because in the end it had led them here. To safety. To freedom. And, for the first time in her life, to love. Not just with the man she would eventually meet in San Francisco, a man who cherished her and Lily in ways David never had, but to love herself, the woman she had become, the mother who could finally breathe without looking over her shoulder. She was no longer a victim of her past. She was the author of her own future. And for the first time it felt like she was truly, completely free.